Hi everyone, welcome to 1.3, Putting an Idea into Practice. This is the third of 5 videos in Theme 1, Investigating Small Businesses. This is the trickiest one so far, I think, in Theme 1 because it's the first one that involves quite a significant amount of the financial calculations. So I'll go through all of those and hopefully in enough depth, but it is worth just stressing that if you want to get really good at the calculations, you need to do a lot of calculation practice. So this has 4 parts to it. The first and the last are fairly straightforward, although sources of finance is something that's examined quite frequently. Revenues, costs, and profits is quite a straightforward concept. The break-even part of things is probably where it gets a little bit complicated. And the cash flow forecast, again, I think is really straightforward, but it's definitely something that needs a little bit of polishing up repeatedly to kind of stay on top of. So I would advise grabbing a pen and paper and making notes as you go through this. 1.3.1 Aims and Objectives is all about the objectives that businesses have when they first start a business. The key thing here is that we're talking about startup aims and objectives because remember Theme 1 is all about investigating small businesses. So when we get into Theme 2 and 2.1, there's a topic called Changes in Aims and Objectives. That talks about how, as a business gets bigger, they move away from some of these kind of objectives and into some more kind of growth-based ones. So we've got 2 categories here. We've got financial and non-financial aims and objectives. We'll start with the financial ones. So the first is obviously survival. For any new business, the main priority is going to be to survive. If your business is surviving, we'll talk about this a bit more when we talk about cash. It can continue going, it can continue trying to grow. And so the first objective for any new business in the first 12, 24, 48 potentially months is going to be to just stay alive. This is also sometimes an objective for expanding, for growing businesses. If, say, for example, or not necessarily growing businesses, but businesses that are a bit more established, because if they're affected by competition or an external shock and their survival is threatened, they might have an objective of surviving, even if they're a business that's previously made a lot of profit. Once you've made that objective of surviving and you've met that, then obviously the next base to kind of conquer is to try and get profit. So profit we'll talk about more as a concept a little bit later on in this video, but the primary aim here is that we're making more money than we're spending. That can lead to financial security, which can be an aim for both an entrepreneur and for a business, where you as a business have enough cash to continue to operate and to operate with a level of comfort where you can take risks because you know you've got enough money saved or in backup that allow you to potentially weather something that might not necessarily go wrong. Market share can be a big factor for businesses in terms of targets. If a business is trying to gain a little bit more market share, it's worth saying that a small market share of a big market can still be quite a profitable business enterprise. So it's not always about just having the biggest market share. It can just be about making sure your market share is a little bit bigger, that higher percentage of the market that you're trying to target. In some cases, sales can be a target. Now, you're probably thinking, what's the difference between a sales target and a profit target? Surely they're the same thing. Well, you'd like to hope that sales and increased sales would lead to increased profit, but sometimes, especially if it's a product that is new to the market and or potentially a product that doesn't have very much reputation, it could be that a business might just seek to maximize sales, even if it doesn't necessarily make much of a profit in the short term, because you're just trying to kind of create awareness and make sure people are aware of the product in the hope that over time that potentially can lead to more profit. So sometimes with a new product or a product without a reputation, they might focus on trying to make sales, even if it costs them quite a lot of money in advertising just to get their name and their brand out there. In terms of non-financial aims and objectives, these are going to be more kind of objectives for the individual starting the business. So personal satisfaction, we talked about this in the reward part of 1.2, the feeling of success, and that could be an objective, maybe to meet a certain target or a challenge perhaps. It could be independence or control. Again, we talked about this in reward, the ability to be in control of your own schedule, the ability to make your own decisions. All of those different things might be an objective that someone might have. And a social objective as well, where it could just be to try and do something to make the world a better place or to fix a certain issue or address a certain cause. It is key to understand the difference between an aim and an objective. An aim is a long-term goal for a business. Your aim is probably something that's going to take you potentially 5 to 10 years to achieve. Your objectives are going to be a bit more short-term. They might take, well, they're not going to be short-term because I think short-term we're thinking sort of within a year. Our objectives might be met within a year, but more likely they're probably going to be potentially 1 to 4, 1 to 3 year targets. And the idea behind the objectives is that by meeting the objectives, you're working towards meeting the aim. So if your aim is to be the biggest business in a certain market in the world, then your objectives need to help you work towards that. So that's aims and objectives. In terms of profit was mentioned as one of those objectives. Let's go through what profit is in a bit more depth. So we've got a few topics, a few key terms to go through here. We're going to start with revenue. I'm going to abbreviate these calculations, but I will talk through them. But hopefully, if you can understand them in terms of the abbreviations, it's going to make working out in an exam question much easier for you. So revenue is the money that we generate from sales. It's not the same as money coming into the business because there's plenty of other ways that aren't involving sales that money can come into the business. For example, we'll talk about a lot of those in sources of finance. But the key thing here is this is the money we've generated from sales. So if we talk about our selling price and we times that by the quantity sold, we'll get the revenue. So if you sell 10 items for £5 each, 5 times 10 is £50 in terms of revenue. So the key thing is revenue is money just generated from sales. Costs are the costs incurred running the business, and these are split into two categories. We've got our fixed costs. These fixed costs don't change depending on output. So it doesn't matter whether you produce 0 items, 1,000,000 items, the fixed costs will remain the same. Fixed costs can change. So for example, rent is a really good example of a fixed cost. Rent can change if the agreement you have with the person you're renting from changes. But it doesn't change depending on output. That's the key factor here. It doesn't matter how many you produce, your fixed costs are your fixed costs. Your variable costs, however, they do change depending on how much you produce. So, for example, the raw materials used in production, naturally, if you produce 10 items instead of 8 items, you're going to spend more on variable costs. So, our total costs are our fixed costs plus our variable costs. But it's worth bearing in mind that our variable costs need to be calculated separately. Our variable costs are going to be our variable cost per unit times by our quantity sold. So if we have a variable cost per unit of £5 and we sell 5 items, that's going to be £25 in variable costs, and we would add that to whatever our fixed costs are. If we've got our revenue and we've got our total costs, we can then calculate our profit, which is how much revenue we have left over after the total costs are paid. And the calculation for this is revenue minus total costs equals profit. You might prefer to do revenue minus, and then in brackets, fixed costs plus variable costs. It's up to you, but I think it's a straightforward concept. This is what my old trainee teacher, the lady who instructed me when I was training to be a teacher, my mentor at the time, she used to always refer to this as the magic formula because she would always say that every decision that a business makes will have an impact in either revenue or costs and therefore profit. And that's what business is all about. Business is all about making a profit because profit is leading to long-term survival. So that's revenue, cost, and profit. But again, as I said at the beginning, if you want to be on top of this, you need to do practice calculation questions. The more you do, the more this sticks in your brain. The next concept is break even. And this is the point at which your revenue equals your total costs. So this is linking to our startup aim and objective of survival, because in order to survive, one of the main ways a business survives is by breaking even. It effectively means you're making as much money as you are spending, so your revenue is equal to your costs. That is break even. The break even output is the number of sales you need to do that break even. So, for example, if we said that a business would break even after 1,000 sales, that means that if you make 1,000 sales, you don't make a profit or a loss. It also means if you make 1,001 sales, you will make a profit, and if you make 999, you'll make a loss. So it's the point at which you don't make a profit, but you also don't make a loss. It's the point at which you kind of covered your costs. Now, you can see this in two different ways. You can see this in a calculation, and you can see this in a graph. We'll start with the calculation. So the calculation is, the calculation is break-even output equals your fixed cost divided by your contribution per unit. But you need to know what your contribution per unit is. So your contribution per unit is, if you take your selling price for an item and you subtract the variable cost per unit, you're effectively taking the amount you receive from selling one item minus the amount that you spent on direct costs making that item. So if we've got a pair of trainers that we sell for £20 and they cost £5 to make, we have made a contribution per unit of £15. It's kind of like our profit per unit, but it's not a profit per unit because profit includes total costs. And it's not profit because we, at that point, when we've got our contribution per unit, haven't taken into consideration our fixed costs. Our break-even output is basically how many contributions do we need to make before we've paid off our fixed costs. Because if we think about our contribution per unit, every contribution per unit we've made, we've paid off our variable cost. That's the whole point, selling price minus variable cost per unit. So we've already paid off our variable costs. So in order to make a profit or break even, we need to pay off our fixed costs. So how many contributions do we need to make to pay off our fixed costs? Which is why we do fixed costs divided by contribution per unit. But again, do some practice calculation questions on those if you want to get better at that. You can also calculate the margin of safety, which is how many sales above a business's break-even point they are. Really straightforward calculation. It's just the actual output minus the break-even output. So for example, if the break-even was 1,000 and you've sold 1,500, the margin of safety is 500. And that shows that the business is basically 500 sales above its break-even point. So it could drop up to 500 sales and still be making a profit. If it dropped more than that, they would obviously be making a loss. You may be asked to interpret this in a graph. So if we look at an example of a graph here, if we've got pounds on the y-axis, quantity sold on the x-axis, you can plot your lines, your cost lines and your revenue lines on this graph to try and identify where the break-even point is. So the easiest one to plot is the fixed cost line. That's going to be straight across because it doesn't matter what the quantity sold is. It doesn't matter what output is. A fixed cost line remains the same. So it's the same number no matter whether you've produced quantity sold of 0 or 1,000. The other one, the other cost obviously line does change depending on output. So our variable cost line would increase as our quantity increased. It would increase by however much our variable cost per unit is. So let's just say, for example, I haven't put numbers on this, but you can get an idea of like how the graph works. Our variable cost increases over time. Our fixed costs stay the same over time, over output. Our total cost line is going to be exactly the same as our variable cost line, except for the fact that instead of starting at 0, because our variable costs will be 0 if we don't make any output, our total cost line will start at our fixed cost line, because even if we produce nothing, our total costs are going to be at whatever our fixed costs are, because we're going to have to pay our fixed costs if we produce nothing. Obviously, as we increase our quantity sold, though, our total cost will increase at the same rate our variable cost line increased. So it should be a completely parallel line, because that's adding the variable costs on top of the fixed cost line. So it's the same line, it's just starting from fixed costs instead of starting from 0. Our revenue will also start at 0, because if we sell 0 items, our selling price times 0 is going to be 0. So our revenue line, let's say for example, looks like this. Our revenue line should hopefully increase at a higher rate. If it doesn't, then we're not charging as much as our variable costs, which would just be, well, it would be quite a stupid thing for a business to do. But what we can see here is if we look at our definition for break-even again, our break-even point was the point at which our revenue equals our total costs. You can see that on the graph. You can see the point at which our revenue and our total costs are equal. You can see it because I've just circled it in blue, but also because you can see it where those two lines meet. So that represents the break-even point. And if you draw that line down to the break-even output, you will see that that is the quantity sold. That's the break-even output. That's how many units we need to sell in order to break even. What you should find is if you ever do one of these in a graph, if you're not sure whether your graph is correct, you should do the calculation, because your break-even output at the bottom on the x-axis should be equal to the calculation method you've done. However, it is worth bearing in mind that if you've plotted the graph yourself, you might have a little bit of human error in terms of your drawing of your lines. If they're not perfectly straight, you might be out slightly, but you'll still be able to get a pretty good idea of whether you're accurate. But what it also does is it illustrates the difference between profit and loss, because if you look towards the very right-hand side, the gap between your revenue and your total costs, that's your profit, basically. And then if you go to the far left-hand side, the difference between your total costs and your revenue, that's the loss that you've made, because you've generated that revenue, but it's not as much as your total cost. Anything to the right of the break-even point is profit. Anything to the left is loss. That's revenue, cost, and profit. We're now going to confuse things by talking about cash, which in theory is similar, but it's not the same. And we've got to make sure we really understand this distinction. So the importance of cash. You need cash to pay your bills. Businesses don't survive if they don't have cash. It's the quickest way that a business fails, and the failure in terms of running out of cash is what we call insolvency. So you need cash to pay suppliers, to pay overheads, to pay employees, to buy materials, to do all of these things. Now, there's a key distinction here, which is the difference between cash and profit. If we look at a profit figure, we are looking at profit over a period of time. So you might say, what was your profit in the last 6 months? And you'd be looking at your revenue and your costs and your profit over that whole 6-month period. That is different to talking about cash, because you might well have made a profit of £75,000 in the last 6 months, but that does not mean that you have £75,000, and it doesn't mean you ever had £75,000 in cash. So your profit is how much you made over a period of time, your revenue minus your costs, but your cash is your immediate spending power. This is how much money you've got right now. And the most important thing here is you can only get revenue by selling things. You can get cash from a whole range of different sources, which we'll talk about in 1.3.4. So part of this cash, so that distinction of cash and profit is really, really important. That's a common theme in the A-level version of this course as well. The cash flow forecast is a projection of cash flows for the future. So it would look something like this. I've just done a really basic one, January, February, and March. And we've got a few sections to here that are worth bearing in mind. We've got inflows. So that is the money coming into the business. We've got the outflows, the money leaving the business. The key thing here is, remember, we've got plenty of other ways we can get cash that aren't necessarily just revenue. We've also got net cash flow, opening balance, and closing balance. I'll talk about those in a little bit, but first I want to go through the inflows and outflows. So if we start with our inflows, these could be two things, for example, cash sales and credit sales, and it's worth explaining the distinction between the two, although we'll touch on credit in a little bit. Cash sales are the sales that are made right now. Doesn't mean that they're using physical cash, it just means the transaction happens immediately and you get the money straight away. So if someone pays on card and the money is transferred straight away, that would still count as a cash purchase. Cash means upfront. A credit sale is a sale that is made like sort of a buy now, pay later. So what you'll notice here with our inflows, when we come up to them, you will have 0 credit sales in the first month because any sales that were made in January on credit will be paid the following month. So these ones, usually a month behind, but it can be more than that. So the credit sales are sales that are made but are paid for later. So they will be a cash flow later on. That's really important when we think about how much cash we've actually got. We've also got some outflows as well. So rent and staff. This section could be really long. To make it simple and to fit it on the PowerPoint that I've got, I've just done 2 examples. Obviously, a business would be much bigger than this. They'd have material costs and all sorts of things. But just for the example's sake of this, just to do the calculations, I've done a shorter version. Inflows, let's say, for example, that in January we have £70,000 in cash but no credit. The credit sales, obviously, we'd get the cash from that the following month. So that would be a total of £70,000. In February, we get £80,000 in cash and £30,000 in credit. So that £30,000 credit, we would have probably made those sales the previous month, but we got the money in February. And that's really, really important because this is not about when we made the sale. This is about when we received the cash. This is a cash flow forecast. It's about when cash comes in and when cash goes out. March, we receive £110 in cash. It could be 110,000. I haven't really specified. The numbers are just made up. And then credit sales of 45. So we've got totals of 70 in January, 110 in February, and 155 in March. In terms of our outflows, let's say that rent is one of our fixed costs. So let's say that rent is 50 every single month. Staff increase over time. Maybe we just bring in more members of staff. So we start at 20, then 30, then 40. You can see that our outflows are 70, 80, and 90. So now we need to have a look at the bottom part of this table. NCF stands for net cash flow. So net cash flow is simply inflows minus outflows. The opening balance, if it's not given to you as 0, is the previous month's closing balance. So if you ended a month with £20 in your bank, you're going to start the next month with £20 in your bank. And then the closing balance, and this is probably the most complicated bit, is the opening balance plus the net cash flow. So if we look at our net cash flows in this table, if you want, obviously you're more welcome to pause them and then fill in the rest of the table in a second. Obviously, I'll take maybe a 2-second pause and then go through, so it gives you a chance to pause it if you want to calculate these. So net cash flows, 0 in January, because we've got 70 in and 70 out. 70 minus 70 equals 0. February is going to be a bit of a better month because we have got more inflows than we have outflows. So the inflows are 110, the outflows are 80. So therefore, we've got a net cash flow of 30. And in March, we've got a net cash flow of 65. So positive net cash flow in all 3 months. That might not always be the case, of course. Sometimes you might have more outflows than you have inflows, in which case we've got to pay attention to our cash flow forecast. But in this case, we've got fairly straightforward numbers. So if we assume that our opening balance is 0, our closing balance is going to be our opening balance plus 0. So 0 plus 0 is going to be 0. The closing balance from January moves into the opening balance from February. I've drawn a little arrow there to show how that works. February's closing balance is going to be opening balance of 0 plus the net cash flow of 30 equals 30. Then the 30 closing balance from February carries over to the opening balance from March. And then we plus the 65 net cash flow gets us £95 or £95,000, depending on how we're doing it. You would use this cash flow forecast if you were putting together a business plan, if you were trying to show a lender or an investor that you had thought about your finances, or maybe just to kind of keep a track of it yourself, just so you've got a bit of an idea about when you might receive cash, when you might need to spend cash. Really important for a business that doesn't have consistent sales, because you might find that, like, for example, an ice cream business, they might make more sales at certain times a year, so their cash flow might be much, much better in the summer than it is in the winter. And so if you're aware of that because you've done a forecast, that can potentially help keep your business going and make sure you've got enough money to run. Right, the last part is sources of finance. We've touched on a few of these already. We've touched on credit, for example. We've touched on profit a little bit. Let's go through these in terms of two groups, short-term and long-term. So the first short-term source of finance is an overdraft. An overdraft is where you can temporarily go into a negative bank balance. So what you would do is you would agree with the bank an overdraft amount. So for example, £1,000, £2,000. And then after that, it's flexible. You can use it whenever you want. So for example, if you've got £50 in the bank and you need to pay a £100 bill, if you've got an overdraft, you can just pay that bill with no worries, because you can go into a negative £50 bank balance. The problem with an overdraft, and why you don't want to rely on one, is that an overdraft carries sometimes a charge every time you use it. And quite often, after a certain amount, there might be quite high levels of interest. So you will have to potentially pay back. Obviously, you have to pay back the money that you've used. If you go negative £50, then you're gonna when you put £50 in, it's not going to give you the £50 to your credit. It's going to take your balance back to 0. But also, they potentially can have some charges. And if you are quite significantly in your overdraft, it can impact on your ability to borrow money again in the future. So this is a really useful source of finance in the short term. If you've got a bill that you need to pay and you don't quite have enough cash, an overdraft can be really useful to get you out of a bit of a situation. The other short-term source of finance is trade credit. We talked about credit when we talked about credit sales, where you might sell a product and receive the money later on. Well, you can use this as a source of finance as well. So you can give credit to your customers, but you can also get credit from your suppliers. So for example, if you wanted to buy some supplies that you needed for a job, but you knew you weren't going to get the money from the job until the job was complete, if you buy the supplies on credit, then you aren't spending the cash outflow yet either. So even though you have to wait a little bit of time to receive the money coming in, you potentially can delay the money going out. So my brother's business, for example, they do this all the time. So they have agreements with their customers that their customers have to pay them within 45 days. So my brother runs an electrician company, electrical contractors, so they will quite often go and buy materials, go to a job, do the job, and then the customer will have to pay within 45 days. My brother, if he buys the materials up front, will have to pay for the costs, which could be thousands of pounds, and then know he's not going to receive the money until later. So he has an agreement with his suppliers that he pays his bills after 60 days. So the idea behind that is, if he's receiving his money from customers in 45 days, he's going to get that before he has to pay his costs. So it should mean, if you manage it effectively, it should mean that you generate cash coming in before cash goes out. It allows you to delay the cash going out. However, this does require a bit more tracking, but also, you've got to make sure that the balances and it works. Those are the two short-term sources of finance. When we say short-term, we're talking about things within 12 months. Longer-term sources of finance, we've got a few more options here. The first and the main one for any new business is you're going to put your own money in, the personal funds. And in fact, any investor or any bank is probably going to want to see that you put in some of your own money before they put some money in as well. The key thing with this is obviously the downside is that you are potentially risking your own money if the business doesn't work out. But the big benefit is you don't have to pay it back to anyone because it's your own money. It's immediately available. Obviously, it depends on how much money you've got. Some people will have more than others, so this might not be enough of a source of finance for some things, but it's the most common one for small businesses and new businesses. Loans are also pretty common. This is where you borrow an amount of money and you pay it back with interest. Interest part of it is really, really important. So you can borrow a sum of money more than you've got, really, really useful, but you will have to pay it back, and you will have to pay it back a little bit more on top as well. The reward for the lender for lending you the money is the interest that they receive. We also have retained profit. This is kind of like personal funds, but instead of it being your own personal money, this is the money that the business has. So this is usually profit from previous years that has been put back into the business, basically. So if a business has made £500,000 in profit, they might keep some of that within the business to fund the following year. The big benefit of this is, of course, that it's already available. It doesn't have to be paid back. There's no interest. It's probably the best source of finance. However, there are some downsides. The more retained profit you use, the less money you are giving to your shareholders or taking out of the business. So there's a potential that that might upset shareholders or disincentivize them from investing further in the business in the future. Also, of course, if you use all of your retained profit and the situation doesn't work, much in the same way we talked about this for personal funds, you potentially could be using your backup cash, which could be kind of a security net, a safety net. We talked about financial security in 1.3.1. There is also share capital for certain types of business, which you will touch on in 1.4. Share capital is where you sell a share of the business. You sell a percentage of the company. There's different ways of doing this. We've got private and public limited companies. Private limited companies is in theme 1. Public limited companies comes up in theme 2. But you can sell a share in the business. Venture capital is also share capital, but specifically to venture capitalists. Venture capitalists are individuals or businesses that are investing money with the intention of making a quick return. So they would be investing in businesses they think are going to have quite a high profit potential. The objective there is they're probably investing not necessarily for the long term. They're investing for a period of time to try and turn their investment, their shares, into more valuable shares, and then they'll get out and sell their share and make their profit. Finally, crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is one I think that students use too frequently when suggesting sources of finance, because crowdfunding only works effectively in certain circumstances. So there has to be a level of virality to a crowdfunding project. It has to be something that is going to raise enough awareness, because crowdfunding is basically where a business receives donations or investments from a range of small potential investors or kind of donators. They will typically get some sort of reward for their investment. For example, it could be if you're in. I remember one of the examples I always use is the fidget cube. The fidget cube raised millions of pounds. It was only trying to raise £15,000 so they could produce more of the fidget cubes, but it went viral and it raised millions. And the reward was, depending on how much you donated, you would get a prize. So one of the prizes would be, if you donated like $18 or whatever it was, you'd get one of the fidget cubes. So the idea is that there is a bit of a cost associated, because you have to provide those. Well, you don't have to, but most businesses will provide those rewards. But it is potentially a nice way of gaining money without having to owe debt or pay interest back. One potential downside is with crowdfunding, sometimes, depending on the website, if you set a target for £30,000, if you don't reach the £30,000, the assumption is that you then can't run the project or do the project. So you have to refund you don't get any of the money. So that's one thing that's potentially a risk with sources of finance. The key thing here is making sure you know what each of the sources of finance are, and you know the benefits and the drawbacks to each of them, because quite common question, like could be, for example, like a 9 marker about choosing between two sources of finance. That's quite a common one. It could be like a 6 marker where it's two benefits, where it could be like benefits of a source of finance or something like that, or drawbacks of a source of finance. So make sure you know what they all are. Make sure you know the benefits and the drawbacks of each. Hopefully you found this one useful. If you've got any questions, then by all means, chuck them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you very much.